Guru Nation, thank you so much for watching and listening. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. We've been on a roll lately with the site focused content. So, what's the clinical research site? How I started Yuma Clinical Trials, uh, what I recommend people do. This topic is going to be about my biggest mistakes launching and running a clinical research site. And I have many. I mean, I've done this now for over 20 years. I'm going on my 21st year of running sites. And I've had in that process probably 5 sites that I've actually like myself started, or at least from a very early stage took over. And I think my best site so far, for a variety of reasons, myself being one of the least variables, because I'm basically the same person. I've changed a lot. I've matured since my first site, but the variable really for Yuma clinical trials has been our location. And that's something that you cannot control as a site owner unless you end up wanting to move like I did. We moved to Yuma, Arizona, and interestingly, it wasn't necessarily to start a site, but it kind of became a good idea. And so, but I've made a lot of mistakes throughout my 20 years of running sites. I think the biggest mistake I made is initially, the biggest mistake I made initially was not learning how to build systems and think in systems. But I was thinking very linearly, like, okay, if we get this study, I'm going to enroll these many patients. I have to do these things, data entry. I've got to process blood. I've got to collect the labs. I got to make sure they do these assessments. I got to make sure the psychometric raters do their rating scales. But it was very linear. It was never, how do I scale this, or how do I build a repeatable system? And I did learn that early on based on a book I read called The E Myth by Michael Gerber. And there's a newer version of his book now called The E Myth Revisited. And it talks about how to build in systems and how to think of whatever business you're running. Chances are it's a sole proprietorship. How to think of it like a McDonald's thinks. Like when you go and open a McDonald's franchise, they don't let you do whatever you want. You're not allowed to do whatever you want. They give you a franchise manual and you have to follow that manual. If you try to do whatever you want, maybe you think, oh, I don't like the way the Big Mac, I want to add sriracha in the Big Mac. They will kick you out. They will actually sue you probably for violating the terms of the franchise agreement. Why? Because they've perfected the system. If you want to do your own burger stuff, you need to not be a franchisor. You need to go start your own burger place. But they've perfected the system down to what temperature the fries should be before you serve them, what temperature the fries should be when you store them, what temperature the patty should be, what phone numbers to call, or what links to click on, and how to order more supplies, napkins. I mean, they've got everything thought through. The toilet paper, nothing is left to chance. Nothing is left to you figuring it out. And you should think of your research clinic the same way. And the problem is, like the closest thing to a franchise we have are site networks, which absorb clinics and repeat scale their model in different geographic regions. And yeah, it's pretty much they operate like a franchise system, but they're wholly own these sites. So someone like me had to build that site before we even get a chance to get acquired by a site network. By the time they acquire us and I sell to them, I'm not a franchisee. I'm just selling my business to a bigger company. A franchise is more like a profit sharing type of agreement. But the point of this podcast is not the difference between a franchise and a wholly owned restaurant. The point is to think in systems. So the biggest mistake I made was leaving everything to chance, leaving everything to variables, and not having a formalized system for everything, including where do we order our toilet paper from? Where do we get toner for our printers? What do we do when a patient inquires about a study? What do we do when we get a referral of a patient that a provider wants to be in a study? How do we approach outside clinicians about referrals? How do we document loss to follow-ups? How do we document IP return, investigational product return? Those things should not be different every time you encounter the situation. Those things should be standardized and uniform so that you, the business owner, can eventually step away from the day to day so you can focus on growing the business. So that's number one, my biggest mistake I made. Number two biggest mistake I made was not having enough of a diversification of specialties. And again, in Yuma, this is something that I don't have a problem with. This is why I think at the end of the day, Yuma Clinical Trials will be the best site I've started. And we're trying to make it become a site network where we can replicate this outside of Yuma in other cities. We're trying to do it in San Luis, Arizona. We're trying to do it perhaps in Oregon, maybe in Texas. But it's because we've had these systems in place. So now the diversification of the studies, the diversification of the study pipelines, the therapeutic indications, pulmonary, psych, derm, gastro, cardiology, women's health, oncology. The more specialists you have, the better your chances of success, because every therapeutic indication has dry spells in research, except for like oncology and central nervous system disorders. Those seem to always be consistent. But if your site only specializes in dermatology or only does respiratory, you're going to have a hard time. And I remember my first sites, I knew this, but I still couldn't diversify. And it's a mistake not putting more emphasis on that. So that's number two. Never start a site without a backup plan of getting more PIs. You can start a site with one PI, but that's just a start. You need a roadmap to get as diversified as you can. And in Yuma, honestly, we're not diversified as much as I would like. We're missing oncology, we're missing women's health, we're missing gastro. There's things that we need to try to figure out, whether we can do it in Yuma or slightly outside of Yuma. But obviously, the more therapeutic areas you can do, the better. Number three biggest mistake I made in launching a site is, let's say I figured out the first two things. All right, we're good. Is the culture, the company culture. It's not just platitudes or something that sounds good for business school. Building a culture, especially if you've built a system where you as the owner, you as the principal can step aside so you can focus on growing the business and working on the business, not working in the business. If you do that and you haven't built a culture, meaning the people you hire, what kind of people do you look for when you hire? I made a vlog about this yesterday. You can find it on my playlist. We document the clinic journey. Just look on the YouTube playlist for that. We look for certain traits in people. Ambition is one. Being a self-starter, being someone that works well under pressure, being able to multitask. These are the traits that we look for. Now, that's fine. Let's say you're able to pinpoint an archetype of a staff member you would like. The next thing you want to do is you want to make sure that there's good chemistry amongst your staff, especially if you are going to be less involved on the day to day. If you don't have a good culture or nip it in the bud quickly, people are going to figure out there's going to be mini power struggles. You're going to have some levels of toxicity. You're going to slowly develop a bad culture. You're going to have either, like I've had in some of my other clinics, a tyrant that comes in and makes life miserable for everyone else, and none of the employees want to work hard. Or you're going to have people who pick and choose when they want to work, and then the rest of the time they don't work. So now it's demotivating for the other people that do want to work constantly. Like you want to have people on the same page. So the culture is super important. That's honestly something that's never a, that's something that's never finished or a done deal. That's something that you're constantly going to have to work on, even if you have removed yourself. And let's say you put a site director in charge of your site, you're still going to have to make sure that the culture is fine. And occasionally we'll need some tweaks. And you have to be able to read the room. Are staff burned out right now? Are they overworked? Are they underworked and bored? Are they not happy with the roles that they have? Does this person want that person's job and that person wants this one's, and secretly they're both plotting against each other? Like, you have to be able to read between those lines and read those things. So culture is another one. Number 4, I guess one of my biggest mistakes in launching a clinical research site is figuring out the projections of a study. So it's not a matter of just getting as many studies as you can, loading people up with the work, giving people things to do for them to be busy. It's about, can you actually do this study? Does it actually make sense for the patients in your community? And will you actually make money off of it? I've had studies where I've never had a study where we lost money, but I've had studies, thankfully, I've had studies where it was almost not worth doing because all the work it took to randomize a patient was not captured in the budget, and there was no way that any negotiator could have negotiated that ahead of time. But if we would have looked carefully under the hood, we would have seen this study is damn near impossible to get patients in. And then they want patients, when they do get in, half of the visits require the patients to be in the office for 8 hours and do PKs every hour. And you're barely paying the patients anything. And those kind of things don't make sense. Now, I understand when you're starting out, maybe it makes sense to get your start, but to continuously not filter out those kind of studies is a mistake, especially as your site's starting to grow, especially as you're starting to develop a culture. You want to be able to make sure that you can actually make money off of the studies you're doing, and that it actually will benefit the patients when they are in that study. Another big mistake is quality. I mean, it's going to sound like a platitude, but quality, and that leads to, it's related to culture in a way, but it's quality and letting things slide. And then essentially you're developing bad habits in your staff. Meaning, and this is where you got to set the rules early as a founder, but it could be from a macro level as, are employees allowed to bring their kids to the office? If so, how often? If so, how long? So that's macro. 2, do employees have to clean up after themselves and keep a clean workstation? Or are you gonna have janitors do that? Like, you have to actually think about these things, and the employees have to know these things. And that's still more of a culture thing. But where it becomes quality assurance is, well, how do we request medical records? And now with these new technologies, there's different ways to do it. Creo, which is a sponsor of this podcast, has a one-click option. They partnered with a vendor that I think it's for $30 if they are successful. You click a button, and within 200-mile radius of that patient's zip code, they're able to pull the records that you want. You can specify which ones you want, and it shows up right in your source. Well, that's an easy way to do it. But what if your patient? What if you don't need that option and your patient is a referral from one of the physicians? Well, what's the process of getting their records under that scenario? Do they have to sign an authorization to release form? Because on Creo, if you click that button, there's technically a separate authorization to release form on Creo that is streamlined. But now if you go another route, well, what's the process there? And if your staff get into the habit of, well, I'm just going to click this button all the time because I'm used to it, not only is it costing you more money and it's maybe unnecessary because you don't need to do it, but now the few times that Creo maybe is not able to get the records, you have to go about it the old-fashioned way. Well, nobody knows the process because no one's been following up with it. So that's where quality assurance comes in. Quality assurance, and we have someone that does quality assurance now for Yuma clinical trials, but they're checking all these documentation things, and this is where it relates to your SOP, your standard operating procedure, which I guess is another big mistake of launching a site, is not paying attention to your standard operating procedures. Even experienced site owners like myself get caught making errors here. And in an audit, especially an FDA audit, this is a serious thing because one of the biggest findings of FDA is if the staff is not following their own SOP. So what's the process for anything? You name it. Lost to follow-up patients, right? It happens all the time. Patients do a study. They don't show up for their next visit. You call, you text, you send the auto reminders, and nothing. They ghost you. And then sure enough, they're out of window. And what do? Well, you get queries in the EDC, and finally you put lost to follow-up. Well, but what's your process? Those patients still have the investigational product. What does your SOP say you're going to do? Generally, it's going to say you make 3 documented attempts to contact the patient. So remember, if you make a phone call or an auto text and it's not documented, it didn't happen. Now, the good thing about auto text is it's documented by default. So a lot of these things can start getting streamlined, and it still covers you, CYA, for those of us in the industry. But let's say you did phone calls. Well, who's documenting that it was done? And it needs to be done 3 times. And then after that, you need to send a certified letter to the patient. What's your process for doing that? And who's going to go to the post office? Or like, you need all these details. This kind of relates back to the first one of having a system. And the SOP is not exactly the same thing as a business system. The SOP is just your procedures for doing the studies. The business systems is more holistic. It's more macro. It's more meta level than that. It's the business itself. The SOP is how you conduct yourself when you do a study. So you need quality assurance in that regard. You need to pay attention to your standard operating procedures, and you need people on the same page. Now, another big mistake research sites make is they don't streamline things. And I'm starting to see the bigger we get, the more we have to get streamlined. As soon as you get a second location, which we're almost going to be doing, like we operate a hybrid hub and spoke model. So we have our main office, the mothership. This is where we kind of put on all the studies as our address. But then each PI has their own office. Sometimes we'll do some visits there, but sometimes we'll dose. But really, like the main hub is where most of that happens. The clinicians' offices are on the 1572 for things like physical exams, sometimes IP storage, sometimes IP dispensation. It just depends on the PI and that particular study. But as soon as you try to scale your site outside of your geographic region into another territory. So for us in Yuma, it's going to be 20 miles away in a town called San Luis, Arizona. Well, that's technically when we're going to need to streamline certain activities. And what activities are they? Well, you can break down research more or less from that SOP I talked about into basically three things for the operations. It's regulatory, it's source, and then it's patient recruitment. Now, of course, you have contracts and budgets. Of course, you have business development, which you need to streamline those as well. But the first things you need to streamline are those three things I mentioned. The regulatory, so who's handling your regulatory, your startup regulatory, your regulatory maintenance, and your closeout regulatory, including IRB stuff. That can be streamlined, especially if your site's using a system like Creo. It makes it a lot easier. The person doesn't even have to live in your region to do that. So that's the benefit of using these digital platforms. But even if you don't use these digital platforms, you can still streamline that. The beauty about eSource, eReg, and anything is that it's dislocated from geography. So if we're gonna eventually streamline our regulatory, we're gonna have a regulatory person, as long as they can handle all of our sites, and when they can't, we hire a second one, or we build a system underneath that first one where there's a chain of command. And again, back to the first thing I started this podcast with, having a system for regulatory. And yeah, it doesn't matter if you live in Iowa and the sites are in Yuma, Oregon, and Rio Grande and San Luis. This person doesn't care. They have access to all the portals and they can streamline everything. And if they're in charge of their department for regulatory, maybe you get big enough to where you have a startup regulatory team and a regulatory maintenance team. You can do that remotely. You can streamline that. Same thing with the recruitment. Now, a good amount of recruitment is local. So you're going to never be able to fully separate from geography recruitment, because recruitment is a very local thing. But with tools like my company that I'm a owner, a co-owner with, shout out to Ronik Ganatra, Patient Ace makes it automated and streamlined as much as we can, the patient recruitment aspect. So we will create the ads for you. Your site doesn't have a Facebook page. Hey, don't worry, we made one for you. We're going to streamline the ads. We're going to create the ads where every part of it is streamlined. The negotiating with Facebook for the pricing, the creative, the text, the distribution, the ads. And then when someone clicks on an ad, what happens? That entire sales funnel gets handled by Patient Ace until, and you can make it automated all the way to where the patient themselves schedule their own appointments, which is what we're working on. We even have a voice AI that can talk to the patients on the phone to pre-qualify them and schedule them. So now we just streamlined, or in the process of streamlining patient recruitment, including pre-qualifications, including ad distributions. Now, again, you're still going to have an element of local recruitment, people going out in the community, doing lunch and learns, meeting with the local Indian tribes here like we do with the Native American tribes. There's a lot of that local stuff, but you can still streamline that. Hey, these people do the recruitment. These people do the regulatory. These people, they're in charge of QA and the source. These ones are in charge of data entry, which we're working on something to get data entry automatically passively entered. There's a company called Gleam that does this now that we're starting to mess around with. The business development that I discussed, You can streamline that. There's another sponsor of the show, Inato. Inato kind of can streamline some of your business development needs. DSCS, which is my company that helps sites get studies and do budgets. We can help you streamline your business development and your contract and budget needs. So it doesn't matter which companies or vendors you use, or employees you use, or you interchange those parts as you see fit, as long as you're streamlining these elements. We're currently at YCT, Yuma Clinical Trials, in year 4. We're not streamlined on a lot of stuff. All of our coordinators are still generalists. We don't have a dedicated regulatory person. We don't have a dedicated recruitment person, but we do use Patient Ace to streamline some of our patient recruitment stuff. And we will, I think, within months, certainly before the year's over, when we start thinking about our next site and we get close to like having our first study at our next site, it will make sense to have a regulatory person dedicated to just regulatory activities for all the sites. So slowly, and then we already use the SES for the contract and budget negotiations. So we've already streamlined that. And then for the business development, we currently use a combo of DSCS and Inato. So we are slowly doing it. We still have other streamlined activities or other activities that are not streamlined that are dependent on me. Like still it's kind of business development. And then anytime we send an invoice to a sponsor for anything, you're looking at him or you're listening to him, the person that does that, it is still me. I will eventually have someone else do that. I think that could be a site director role. And site director role would also take care of things like human resources and handling employee culture and things like that. There's certain elements of the business that I don't think the business owner can ever fully escape or delegate. And I think creating a company culture is one of them. And myself and my business partners, we're often reminded of this, sometimes the hard way. And the culture, which I don't know, we're not keeping track of what number. I think it was number 3 that I mentioned on this. It's one that you cannot ignore. But I think more or less, those are the biggest mistakes I made. There's, of course, like more rookie mistakes that I've made, like thinking that you can just screen everyone under the sun and sponsors not going to care. Well, no, they are. They're eventually going to ask you, what's your pre-screening process? And then they're going to look in your SOPs. I used to think that it would be really easy to make money. It's actually not. Like, you have to, if you want to have a sustainable business and one that's can last beyond your efforts, or at least your day-to-day efforts, it takes significant energy to put into building these things. And so that's some of my biggest mistakes in launching a clinical research site. I think another one, the last one, maybe a bonus one, it should be an obvious one. We've covered it in other podcasts before, but it's which PIs you end up working with, because you can always change a coordinator. You can always, let's say one coordinator, let's say you made a bad hire and this coordinator is not good. Well, you can always, and let's say you're a nice person. Like, well, they're just not a good coordinator, but they're still a good person. We still want them here. Well, you can make them a recruiter, or you can make them do your invoicing if you're big enough, or you can make them do regulatory, whatever. If you partner with the wrong PI and you partner with them and you negotiate bad deals, meaning, hey doc, I'm going to get studies and give you half of whatever we make or whatever we bring in. Like, that's a bad deal off the bat. And that's a big mistake I made. I actually made that deal with someone before, and I would never do it again. 50% gross of what we make to give a PI is a mistake, in my opinion. It should be somewhere between 20 to 30, whether they're a contractor or not, or less, meaning maybe they want a monthly stipend. But if you're going by percentage, which most site owners do, 20 to 30 whether they're a contractor or a business partner with you. And if you pick the wrong PI and you pick the wrong deals, or you negotiate the wrong deals with even the right PI, those are kind of two mistakes. Structuring the deal with each PI and choosing the right PI. Those are big mistakes, and those are like the bonus mistakes. Now, what is the right PI? That's a lot harder to describe than what is the right PI. The right PI is someone that does want to look out for patient safety and is not looking, I mean, they're all looking for extra income, but it's not what drives them. Like maybe a little bit, we're all human, we're all doing this not because we're Mother Teresa, but because we want to have a business. But when there's no safety framework, and there's no safety oversight, and there's no interest in even attempting to do that, that's a red flag. And you're not, oftentimes you're not going to find out till it's too late. This is why I wouldn't partner with a PI until they become a contractor for you and you're comfortable working together. So, and then what's a bad deal? Like I said, 50%. Honestly, I think anything over 30% gross is a bad deal. So those are the two mistakes that are bonus mistakes. Hopefully this was enough. My biggest mistakes launching a clinical research site over the past 20 years. Thank you very much for watching and listening. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Hey, if you guys like that kind of content, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Stay tuned for more videos.